The city council president, who had been a regular at the Regal Beagle in his youth, looked at the data and then at the three friends who had defined the boardwalk for generations. "Order rescinded," he announced. "The architecture is sound." The crowd erupted in a cheer that could be heard all the way to the pier. Eleanor Prynne turned and walked away, her glass horizon finally shattered by the strength of a century-old arch. Chapter 45. The Architecture of Eternity. The celebration lasted for days. The culinary school opened its doors that September, with Sophie as the head instructor and Jack as the professor emeritus of Soul. Cindy stayed in Santa Monica, moving into a small apartment just down the hall from 201. The three were together again, their laughter echoing in the hallways just as it had in the 70s, though the topics of conversation had shifted from bad dates to the legacy of their grandchildren. One evening, Sophie and Victor sat on the balcony of the restaurant. They had finished their book, The Architecture of Truth, and the first copy sat on the table between them. "What now, Sophie?" Victor asked. Sophie looked at the vial of salt of the earth, which now sat in a glass display case in the center of the dining room. "Now," Sophie said, leaning her head on his shoulder, "we just live the truth. We build our own wing. We make sure the door is always open." As the Santa Monica moon rose, casting a silver path across the water, the architecture of Ali was no longer a story of deception. It was the architecture of eternity, a home built on the only foundation that truly lasts, the people who knock on the door and the love that makes them stay. And in apartment 201, the lights were on, the table was set, and company, well, company was the only thing that mattered in the end. Chapter 46. The Order of the Silver Spatula. The worldwide success of The Architecture of Truth was a double-edged sword. While it brought pilgrims to the boardwalk, it also caught the eye of a shadow organization known as the Order of the Silver Spatula. This group, a cabal of the world's most powerful and secretive gourmands, had spent centuries collecting lost flavors and culinary relics. One evening, a man with a silver cane and a monotone voice entered Tripper's table. He didn't order from the menu. He simply pointed to the display case, holding the salt of the earth. "That vial doesn't belong in a glass box, Sophie Tripper," the man said. "It belongs to history, and history is a very demanding landlord." The man, who introduced himself as Count Valerius, claimed that the spice was part of a larger set of elemental salts used by Renaissance kings to keep their kingdoms in balance. He offered Sophie a blank check for the vial. "My family's resilience isn't for sale, Count," Sophie replied firmly. Valerius smiled, a thin, mirthless expression. "The architecture of truth is a beautiful concept, but you forget one thing. The truth can be stolen as easily as a lie." Chapter 47. The Midnight Intruder. The threat wasn't empty. 2 nights later, the silent alarms in the restaurant were triggered. Sophie, who was staying in the apartment above with Victor, rushed down with a heavy rolling pin. They found the display case shattered, but the vial was gone. The intruder hadn't used a lockpick or a glass cutter. They had used a high-powered sonic device that had turned the reinforced glass into dust. "They're professionals, Victor," Sophie whispered, looking at the empty pedestal. But Victor noticed something. On the floor, among the glass shards, was a single, small silver bead, the head of Count Valerius's cane. He didn't just take the spice, Victor realized. He left a calling card. He wants us to follow him. The quest led them to a hidden estate in the hills above Malibu, a fortress of steel and glass that stood in stark contrast to the wooden warmth of the boardwalk. This was the glass horizon that Eleanor Prynne had dreamed of, but far more sinister. Chapter 43. The Ghost of the Regal Beagle. While Sophie and Victor were chasing the Count, Jack and Janet decided to do some investigating of their own. They returned to the basement of the Regal Beagle, convinced that Arthur Prynne had hidden more than just photographs. They spent hours tapping on the stone walls, until Jack found a loose brick. Behind it was a small, lead-lined box containing a set of letters from the 1920s. "Janet." "Look," Jack said, his voice hushed. "These are from my grandfather to Arthur Prynne's father. They were partners. They didn't just build the boardwalk. They were protectors of the salt of the earth." The letters revealed that the spice wasn't just a memory. It was a catalyst. When used by someone with a pure heart, it could heal the spirit of a community. But in the hands of the selfish, it was just. The Order of the Silver Spatula wants it because they think it's a spice for kings, Janet realized. But it only works for roommates. This was the final piece of the architecture. The building stood not because of the arch or the hinges, but because the spirit of the people was literally seasoned by the truth. Chapter 49. The Italian Departure 2. To get the vial back, Sophie and Victor realized they couldn't just use force. They had to go back to the source, Calabria, to find the counter spice. They returned to Santo Nicola di Trippa, but this time they were pursued by the Order's drones. "You seek the bitter root," she said through the translator. "The salt brings the balance, but the root brings the clarity. One cannot exist without the other." She led them deeper into the cave, to a spot where the salt-heavy air met an underground spring. There, growing in the dark, were translucent, pale roots that smelled of ozone and earth. "Take the root, Sophie," Nonna Rosa commanded. "When the Count uses the salt to feed his ego, the root will show him the architecture of his own lies." The journey back was a race against time. The Order was planning a feast of the century in Paris, where they would use the salt of the earth to manipulate the world's most powerful leaders into signing a treaty that would give the Order control over the world's food supply. Chapter 50. The Final Revelation. The Paris Opera House was filled with the elite. Sophie and Victor, disguised as catering staff, watched as Count Valerius prepared the main course. He held the vial over a massive silver tureen, his face glowing with a dark triumph. As he sprinkled the dark crimson grains into the soup, Sophie stepped forward. "Wait!" she shouted. The Count laughed. "Too late, Sophie. The world is about to taste the truth of kings." "No," Sophie said, pulling the bitter root from her pocket and dropping it into the tureen. "They're about to taste the truth of the people." The reaction was instantaneous. The soup didn't turn into a magical elixir. It turned into a mirror. Every person who took a sip didn't feel like a king. They felt the weight of their own deceptions. The politicians saw their broken promises. The CEOs saw their exploited workers. The room was filled not with power, but with a profound, collective shame. Count Valerius, who had tasted the soup first, collapsed. He saw the glass horizon of his ego crumbling into the sea. "The architecture," he gasped. "It's not glass. It's wood." Sophie and Victor walked out of the opera house, the vial back in their hands. They didn't return it to the display case. They took it back to apartment 201, where Jack, Janet, and Cindy were waiting with a simple dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup. Sophie opened the vial and sprinkled a single grain into each of their bowls. "What is it, Sophie?" Jack asked. "It's just salt, Dad," she said, smiling. "But it's our salt." As they sat together, the five of them, the boardwalk outside was quiet, the waves a gentle pulse against the sand. The architecture of a lie was a ghost of the past. The architecture of truth was a monument for the future. But the architecture of home, that was just a table, some soup, and the people who would always be there when you knocked on the door. The End, the Cowboy of Apartment 201. A novel of romance, deception, and shag carpeting. Prologue. The Golden Hour of Santa Monica. The Pacific Ocean was a bruised purple, reflecting a sun that refused to go down without a fight. In Santa Monica, the air smelled of salt, coconut-scented tanning oil, and the distant, greasy promise of burgers from the pier. It was 1979, an era defined by disco beats and the precarious balancing act of three young people sharing a two-bedroom apartment. Apartment 201 was more than just a living space. It was a sanctuary of pastel colors and wicker furniture. But tonight, the air inside was thick with more than just the humidity of a California evening. It was thick with Jack Tripper's frustration. Chapter 1. The Tongue-Tied Chef. Jack Tripper sat at the kitchen table, a dog-eared Spanish textbook spread before him like a battle map. He was a man of many talents. He could julienne a carrot in seconds and bake a soufflé that didn't collapse under the weight of a heavy sigh. Hoot, linguistics, was his Achilles heel. "Mi llamo Jack," he muttered, his voice a low rasp. "Dinner will be served at 8. La cena será a las 8. He was dreaming of a cruise ship. A friend had landed a gig cooking in the Caribbean simply because he could navigate a menu in Spanish. For Jack, stuck in the grind of culinary school and part-time shifts, the idea of the open sea and a kitchen that smelled of lime and cilantro was intoxicating. "Jack, are you still at it?" He looked up. Janet Wood stood in the doorway, her hair perfectly coiffed in that sensible yet stylish bob that always seemed to catch the light. Janet was the anchor of the trio, a florist with a heart of gold and a temper that only flared when the rent was late. "Mucho lousy, Janet," Jack sighed, dropping his head onto the book. "I'm trying to tell someone to bring me a bottle of red wine, and it sounds like I'm asking for a glass of goat's blood." "Why the sudden rush to be bilingual?" she asked, leaning against the counter. "Opportunities, Janet. The world is bigger than Santa Monica. I found out about this cruise ship job. If I can just master the basics, I'm gone." Sailing into the sunset with a whisk in my hand. Janet felt a strange, sharp pang in her chest. The idea of Jack leaving of the apartment without his clumsy charm and the smell of his experimental sauces felt wrong. "You'd leave us for a boat?"